In Orlando, Florida, what was supposed to be a regular assignment for two journalists became a horrific act of violence. Dylan Lyons, a dedicated reporter, was killed. Jesse Walden, a photographer, was left critically injured. In broad daylight, they were ambushed while simply doing their jobs. But who is behind this attack? And what led to this senseless act of violence? By the end of this story, you'll discover how a peaceful community was shaken to its core, and the disturbing chain of events that led to this deadly encounter. On February 22, 2023, the bustling city of Orlando, Florida, witnessed a shocking attack that left one person dead and another fighting for their life. Dylan Lyons, a respected journalist with Spectrum News 13, was killed in cold blood. His colleague, photographer Jesse Walden, was critically injured during what should have been a routine news assignment. As they covered the aftermath of an earlier shooting, they became victims of an ambush, struck down by a gunman who appeared without warning. What was originally thought to be an isolated act of violence quickly became a much more complicated and unsettling story. Dylan Lyons was a 24-year-old journalist, known for his dedication to his craft and his commitment to telling the stories that mattered. Jesse Walden, a seasoned photographer, had been alongside Dylan for years, capturing the moments that would inform the public and shape the narrative. Both were respected in their field and loved by their colleagues. But on that day, their lives were violently interrupted. The person responsible? Keith Melvin Moses, a man with a violent history and a dark past, now facing charges for a crime that no one saw coming. Orlando Police Department investigators worked tirelessly to uncover the truth behind the attack, piecing together evidence and tracking down leads. But the question remained, what had driven Moses to ambush two journalists in cold blood? And was this truly a random act, or was there a deeper, more personal motive at play? It was around 4:30 p.m. when Dylan Lyons and Jesse Walden, both working for Spectrum News 13, arrived at the scene of an earlier shooting to cover the aftermath. The two were sitting in their news van, preparing for the next story, when suddenly, without warning, the unthinkable happened. A gunman appeared out of nowhere and opened fire, killing Dylan instantly and leaving Jesse fighting for his life. The attack was swift and brutal, and before anyone could react, the shooter vanished into the night. At first, law enforcement thought this could be a random act, a shooting with no clear target, but the deeper they dug, the more troubling details began to surface. It wasn't long before investigators uncovered that the shooter had a history of violence. Keith Melvin Moses, the 19-year-old suspect, had already been tied to a prior murder that occurred earlier in the day. The authorities were left questioning, was this just another senseless shooting, or was there something more personal driving Moses' actions? The investigation quickly revealed that Moses was no stranger to the police. Just hours before ambushing Dylan and Jesse, he had already been involved in another crime, the murder of a woman named Tiana Major. The connection between the two shootings wasn't immediately clear, but it added a layer of complexity to the case. Was Moses targeting people in the media? Was there something specific about Dylan and Jesse's assignment that made them the focus of his rage? The deeper the police went into Moses' past, the more complicated the case became. Early witnesses spoke of Moses acting strangely in the days leading up to the attack. Some mentioned seeing him roaming the streets, muttering about perceived injustices. Was this a case of someone unraveling under pressure, or was there something more behind the violence? Investigators soon discovered that Moses had a history of violence dating back to his teenage years, but the full picture of his motivation was still clouded in mystery. As authorities continued to sift through evidence and testimonies, one thing became clear: the attack on Dylan and Jesse was no random incident. The question remained, What had sparked this outburst of violence against two innocent people just doing their jobs? And was there a connection between Moses' earlier murder and the ambush on the journalists? The answers seemed elusive, and as investigators dug deeper, the tension in the case only grew. Dylan Lyons was much more than a reporter. He was a journalist driven by the desire to bring important stories to light. A graduate of the University of Central Florida, Dylan had always been committed to his work. He wasn't just reporting the news, he was part of the heartbeat of his community, telling the stories that others sometimes overlooked. Dylan's calm demeanor and his ability to ask the tough questions made him stand out in the field. He had an eye for the details that made a story come to life, all while maintaining a sense of humanity that made him beloved by his colleagues. His work wasn't just a job to him, it was a calling. Whether covering local politics or tragic events, Dylan always showed up, ready to inform, educate, and sometimes, even comfort those who needed it most. His death left an emptiness not just in the newsroom but in the lives of many who admired him for his work and integrity. Jesse Walden, the photographer who was also in the van that day, was left with wounds both physical and emotional. Jesse, like Dylan, had been at the scene to report, to capture the images that would tell the public about the tragedy that had unfolded earlier. But unlike his colleague, Jesse survived. That fateful day would change his life forever, as the trauma of that violent attack haunted him long after the ambulances had come and gone. The bullet that struck Jesse left him fighting for his life in the hospital, but the physical scars were only part of the story. The emotional toll of surviving such a brutal, senseless attack would be far more complicated to heal. For Jesse, the violence wasn't just about recovering from his injuries, it was about rebuilding a life that had been shattered in an instant. The man he once was before the ambush, the dedicated photographer, would be forced to change as he came to terms with what happened. Keith Melvin Moses, the man responsible for the attack, had a long history that made him well known to law enforcement. At just 19 years old, Moses had already been involved in multiple violent incidents. He was no stranger to the criminal justice system, and yet, the senselessness of the attack on Dylan and Jesse was still a shock. He had been arrested before for violent offenses, but no one could have predicted that he would escalate to this point. The day of the ambush was just another in a string of violent actions that seemed to define Moses' troubled life. What drove Moses to target two journalists, people who were only there to report on a separate tragedy? It's a question that many still struggle to answer. Was it a personal grudge, a random act of violence, or was there a deeper, more inexplicable motive behind his actions? Moses, with his history of violent crime, had managed to evade justice before, but this time, the consequences of his actions were about to catch up with him in a way he never anticipated. As soon as the ambush occurred, the Orlando Police Department launched a full-scale investigation. Detectives worked tirelessly to connect the dots between Moses' previous crimes and the shooting of Dylan and Jesse. In the days that followed, they unraveled a disturbing portrait of a young man whose troubled past was filled with violent episodes. As the police tried to make sense of the situation, it became apparent that Moses' history with violence was not merely an unfortunate coincidence. There had to be something more behind the attack, something that had led to the brutal ambush of two innocent people doing their jobs. But what was it? The investigation would unfold slowly, revealing details about Moses' mindset, his actions, and his ultimate motive. For the police, the key to understanding the shooting lay in understanding who Keith Melvin Moses truly was and what had pushed him to target these specific victims. As the investigation moved forward, the authorities would soon realize that finding the truth would be more difficult than they had first imagined. Following the attack on Dylan Lyons and Jesse Walden, the investigation into the shooting quickly revealed troubling information that painted a much darker picture than anyone initially imagined. It was soon clear that this wasn't a random act of violence, as it first appeared. The Orlando Police Department's investigators uncovered a troubling history that pointed back to the shooter, Keith Melvin Moses. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly falling into place, but the picture was far more complex than anyone had anticipated. Keith Moses had been arrested before for violent crimes, and his history made him someone familiar to law enforcement. However, the sheer brutality of this attack was different from what anyone had expected. Moses had a violent past, but had he escalated his actions to target journalists specifically? Investigators were left questioning whether this was just another crime of opportunity, or if there was a deeper, more personal reason behind his violent outburst. As detectives dug deeper into the timelines surrounding the shooting, they began to discover that Moses was reportedly in the same area as Dylan and Jesse earlier in the day, just hours before the ambush. The presence of Moses in the area, combined with his violent history, pointed to the possibility that the attack wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment act of violence. This was no random shooting. The question was Moses deliberately targeting the journalists, or did they become victims of his rage because of something else? As the investigation moved forward, the police began to piece together a series of strange encounters. Authorities uncovered a witness who claimed that Moses had been ranting about feeling disrespected by the media. This was a crucial lead, one that suggested there could have been some deeper motivation behind the shooting. Was Moses targeting the media as a whole, or were Dylan and Jesse simply the victims of a larger, broader anger that Moses had been harboring for some time? In the days following the attack, investigators began scouring surveillance footage from the area. The footage proved to be invaluable in tracking Moses' movements before and after the shooting. It was clear from the images that Moses had been acting erratically, but the footage alone wasn't enough to explain his actions. There was still something missing. The police needed to understand what had been going through Moses' mind in the lead-up to the ambush. What was the trigger that led him to pull the trigger that day? To get a clearer picture, detectives sought out a former friend of Moses, someone who had known him before his life spiraled into violence. This associate was able to shed some light on Moses' state of mind prior to the attack. According to the friend, Moses had been growing more frustrated and bitter, particularly towards the media. He had expressed anger about how he was portrayed in the news and how he believed the media had disrespected him in the past. The frustration Moses felt wasn't just an isolated incident, it had been building for some time. According to this associate, Moses had been speaking about how he thought journalists often painted people like him in a negative light, and how he felt that he had been mistreated by the press. These pieces of the investigation started to paint a clearer picture of who Keith Melvin Moses was in the moments leading up to the attack. The more authorities uncovered, the more it became clear that the shooting was not just a random act of violence, it was something far more personal. Yet, questions still remained. What was it that made Moses target Dylan and Jesse specifically? Could it have been just the timing of their presence, or was there more to the story than anyone could have imagined? As investigators worked tirelessly to connect the dots, the community anxiously waited for answers. The questions surrounding Moses' motive remained at the forefront of the investigation, but with each new revelation, it became increasingly clear that there was a far deeper connection between Moses' troubled past and the brutal ambush that unfolded that day. Yet, as detectives continued to uncover more about Moses' actions, the motive behind the attack still eluded them. The investigation seemed to grow more complicated with each new lead, and for those following the case, it became clear that the road to answers was anything but straightforward. As the investigation moved forward, there was mounting pressure on law enforcement to uncover the truth behind the ambush. It wasn't long before the breakthrough came. Keith Melvin Moses was arrested and charged with both murder and attempted murder. Authorities had finally brought him into custody, but the most pressing question still remained: why did Moses target Dylan and Jesse? Why were two journalists chosen as the victims in this senseless attack? With Moses in custody, investigators were able to delve deeper into his mind and his motivations. What they discovered about Moses' feelings toward the media painted a troubling picture. Authorities learned that Moses had been harboring a long-standing resentment against journalists, viewing them as adversaries who misrepresented the truth. He believed that the media often failed to tell the full story, instead focusing on narratives that painted individuals like him in a negative light. Moses had become increasingly bitter, convinced that journalists were part of a system that kept people like him in the shadows, never giving them the voice they deserved. It was clear now that his violence wasn't just about anger, it was about his perception of an unjust system that he felt had continually wronged him. Dylan and Jesse were, in Moses' eyes, symbols of that system. They were journalists, part of an institution that Moses had grown to loathe. In his mind, they represented the press that had failed him, the same press that he believed had done him harm in the past. Their assignment that day, seemingly routine and innocent, was seen through the lens of his growing hostility towards the media. This was not a random act of violence. Moses had a clear motive. His violent outburst was fueled by a deep-seated rage against journalists, and Dylan and Jesse became the unfortunate victims in a larger narrative of mistrust and animosity towards the media. Once authorities uncovered this detail, it began to make sense why Moses had singled out these two specific victims. It wasn't about their individual roles or who they were personally. It was about the institution they represented. Dylan, with his investigative journalism, and Jesse, capturing the images that told the stories, became targets because of the work they did every day, work that Moses felt was dishonest, work that perpetuated what he saw as the false narratives of the media. The resolution of this case was bittersweet. With Moses behind bars, the immediate threat to the community had been neutralized. However, the questions surrounding the deeper societal issues Moses' actions brought to light were far from answered. His hatred towards the media, while horrifying, was a stark reminder of the growing distrust and division in the country. Dylan's life had been taken in the blink of an eye, and Jesse's future was irrevocably altered. While justice for the crime was a step forward, it didn't erase the larger problem that Moses' attack had exposed. Dylan and Jesse's deaths were not just tragic losses, they were a reflection of a deeper, more unsettling cultural shift. As the investigation wrapped up and the trial of Keith Melvin Moses began, the legacy of what happened on February 22, 2023, continued to resonate. For the victims, their families, and the entire community, the scars of that day would never fully heal. Dylan's family would never get to hear him tell another story, and Jesse would never be the same man he was before that day. But as time passed, the case would serve as a chilling reminder of the dangers faced by those who seek to uncover the truth in a world where that truth is increasingly questioned and misunderstood. Ultimately, Moses was convicted, but the damage done to the victims and the broader societal trust in the media was far more complicated than any legal resolution could fix. The truth behind the attack was now known, but it left a scar that no conviction could ever truly heal. The tragic deaths of Dylan Lyons and the critical injuries of Jesse Walden are a stark reminder of the dangers journalists face every single day. These two men were simply doing their jobs, reporting the news, when their lives were violently interrupted. But their story also raises difficult questions about the state of our society's relationship with the media. Was this attack a reflection of growing hostility toward journalists, or was it simply a random act of violence that tragically involved the wrong people? The answers may not be easy to find, but one thing is certain: their lives, their work, and their sacrifice will not be forgotten. Do you think the way the media portrays violent events contributed to the ambush? Could this attack have been avoided if there had been a different approach to how stories are reported? Comment below with your thoughts, and share how you think this situation could have unfolded differently. What do you believe needs to change in how we view and treat journalists? And don't forget to like and subscribe for more true crime stories that make you think.